Yeah, thank you guys so much for coming. I'm super excited to, first of all, to be here and also to give a talk. This is a topic that I'm really excited about. So I am Justin, and I'm an engineer on the Flutter framework team at Google. And this topic of shortcuts, intents, and actions is something that we ended up using a lot internally in the Flutter framework and had a lot of success with. So I want to hopefully add this tool to all of your tool belts as well and show you how you can interact with the ways that we've used it in the framework. So my history with this, around like 2020 or so, lots of us were working on bringing support for Flutter Desktop to Flutter. And for me, working on a lot of text editing stuff, started looking at support for keyboard shortcuts, especially for text editing. So things like the basics like Command A to select all text and everything that goes with that. And at the time, we had a few like keyboard shortcuts like the arrow keys and things that were kind of just like strapped into a class called render editable, which, if you're not familiar, has to do with rendering editable text and does not have to do with handling user shortcuts and keyboard and things like that. But at the time, we just had a raw keyboard listener in there doing that. And so we started on the project to replace all of this with shortcuts, actions, and intents, provide support for all of the reasonable keyboard shortcuts that you have natively on Windows, Linux, and Mac. And also make those all customizable by you guys in your own apps. And we had like a lot of community interactions with this project. It was really cool. Even the like final PR that removed that raw keyboard listener and render editable was a community contribution outside of Google, which was really awesome. And at the end of the day, we supported, well, most keyboard shortcuts. We're always finding new ones that we don't support, but all of them on all three platforms are customizable. So I want to show you guys how to do that and how to work with those customizable keyboard shortcuts. All right, so to explore this concept, I wrote this drawing app here, which you can see I've faithfully recreated the Flutter logo. A lot of the icons on the side that you see don't actually work. So like I couldn't really do angles or anything like that. But this is a talk about keyboard shortcuts, not about like beautiful design. So this will serve our purposes. So let me just go ahead and show you guys this app running so that we can take a look. I have a link to the code and a live demo right there. And we're going to keep coming back to this app. But here's my Flutter Paint demo. So yeah, so I can like draw rectangles and things like that. And then I can use the keyboard to do some kind of basic stuff like I can Command C and Command V and paste these things. And I can like press delete and delete them, stuff like that. So these kind of basic keyboard shortcuts, but also things that kind of overlap with the native keyboard shortcuts. So when I do something like add a text field, maybe, we have a little bit of overlap here because when I type, if I do something like press the backspace key, I probably want that to actually delete the text like you saw and not just immediately delete the whole what I call mark here, anything in my drawing canvas. So we're going to have to look at how we can handle those overlapping situations and decide for ourselves when we want to do the native behavior and when we want to do something custom. So actually in this case, one thing that we're going to build up to is this feature here. I think like I said, you want the delete key, the backspace key to actually do backspace when you're focusing the text field. But maybe when you delete all of the text and press backspace, you want it to remove that. So we're going to look at that kind of like overlapping behavior and how we can decide when we want Flutter to handle it and when we want to handle our own keyboard shortcuts. All right, so back to the presentation. The things I mentioned previously that you see on the canvas, I called them marks. So I might have like something called my mark widget. And in Flutter, in the framework in general, we have always like growing features and widgets that are now used for new things that they weren't before. We were always adding customizability. And so often when we do that, we end up like adding new parameters to widgets. And so if I wanted to allow like this mark widget to be customized for the keyboard shortcuts that it supports, naively, I might just add some callbacks to it. If I want to change the keys that you use to trigger those, naively again, I might just pass those in as keys. But as this grows, as we add more and more keyboard shortcuts, the number of parameters just explodes like crazy. And so one thing that shortcuts, intents, and actions lets us do is by like passing messages up and down the widget tree, we can kind of circumvent using parameters just like that. And so ideally, we can get the simplicity of very few parameters, something like at the top, but still have the flexibility of something like this where everything is customizable by the user. So we're going to see how that works in a second. But what is the shortcuts, intents, and actions system? Well, at its core, it is based on the focus system, and it's going to use that to pass messages up and down the widget tree. So here's a focus widget. You guys may have used this before. It has an on-key event parameter that just programmatically allows you to receive key events from this if it's focused. And this is kind of like the core of shortcuts, intents, and actions. But one like layer above this, we have a widget called callback shortcuts. And this gives you like a more declarative approach to listening to keyboard shortcuts. So rather than just having a single callback for everything, you provide a map, and that map maps from keys, like for example, Control A in this case, to a callback. So mapping directly keys to callbacks. But shortcuts, intents, actions, the full thing, is one layer of abstraction above this. So in shortcuts, intents, actions, we have an actions widget, and that doesn't map keys to callbacks. It maps intents to callbacks. So like for copy, it might map my copy intent to actually the code that does copying. But then the shortcuts widget maps the keys to the intent. So that's the kind of layer of indirection that we have here with the intents in between. Rather than going directly keys to callbacks, we go keys to intents to callbacks. And just for the record, we also have actions.invoke, which like programmatically I can call this with my own intents. So I don't have to always just use a mapping of keyboard shortcuts. I can also use the system with like tapping or any other user interaction or really anything. So the reason behind this, you might wonder, like, why did we add that layer of indirection when mapping keys to callbacks is so simple? And the reason is coupling, really. It changes how our widgets are coupled together. So when I say tight coupling, I might mean something like a class that directly tells another class what to do. And in that case, they both kind of have to know about each other. Widget A is directly telling widget B to do something and expecting that it will do it. Widget B has to know what to do. So they both kind of have to know about a high-level concept of maybe business logic here. But in a more loose coupling situation like shortcuts, intents, and actions allows, widget A might just kind of like shoot some kind of information out into space and not really care about who is going to receive that or if anybody receives that at all. Meanwhile, widget B might just be listening to that and taking some actions based on the information it sees go by without really caring who sent that message. And so we have a little bit of indirection in between those two. And this is the kind of thing that shortcuts, intents, and actions allows. So a little bit different architecture. There are valid use cases for both the direct mapping and something more loosely coupled, but this is the kind of architecture that gets opened up with shortcuts, intents, and actions. All right, so we've seen kind of like the high-level explanation of what this is, but let's look at some actual code in the app and see what happens when we actually run it. So we'll start with just actions itself. And let me get back to my demo app. So we're going to go back to my actions demo here. So I've just got a button in the middle of the screen, and I'm going to look at the source code here. So all I've got just a text button in the middle of the screen. And what I want to do to demonstrate this is invoke an action, or rather invoke an intent here in the onPressed handler. And then I want to add an actions widget up above that will receive that intent. All right, so let's move on to that step here. If I look at the code, so now I've added that. I'm calling actions.invoke like I talked about. I'm passing push button intent, which if I scroll down, I've defined that down below. So it's just a little custom empty class here, push button intent. We're invoking that. And then up above, we've got an actions widget that is mapping push button intent to a callback. And so what we're going to do just to demonstrate is show a snack bar really quick. All right, so let's go back to the app. And if I tap this, nothing happens. And that's because I've set a trap for myself here. And there's a bug in this code. And I wonder if anybody out there can see it. Now, I'm going to ask like a lot of these kind of questions in this talk. And this is not the easiest one. But I wonder if anybody sees it. We do have like the push button intent. It is defined. It's right here. And we are mapping push button intent. But there's a bug here. I wonder, does anybody see it? Anybody want to venture a guess? Yes. Exactly. So context. The problem here is that the context that we're calling actions.invoke with right here, that context comes from the build method way up here. So in the tree, this build context is basically at the very top of this page. So it's above the actions widget. And so when actions invokes this, and then it traverses the tree looking for some actions that handle push button intent, it starts that traversal way already above the actions widget, so it's never going to find it. All right, so to fix that, we're going to have to just use a build context from lower down. So looking at the final code here, I've just added a builder here. So that gives me a context, and I can pass that in. And then I'll start the traversal from here lower down in the tree, and it will find this actions widget that's mapping my intent. So let's make sure that that works. And there we go. Great. Thank you. All right, so let's go back to our presentation if I close all these windows. All right, so another quiz question for you guys. Now we've got two actions widgets nested. And in this comment here, we're going to do something basically like we saw. So like pushing a button and calling actions.invoke on the correct context down here. So two nested actions widgets, a higher one. When I say higher, I mean like closer to the root of the widget tree, and lower would be closer to the leaf. So my question, which actions widget will receive this intent? And I guess let's do like a raise of hands. But for a second, I'm gonna pull that. I have this demo in my app, so I'm gonna pull that up really quick. All right, so by a show of hands, who says that the higher actions will receive the intent? All right, here we are. And anybody say the lower actions will receive the intent? It is not. Well, by overridable, there's actually something called actions.overridable, which we're going to get into. So if that's what you mean, no. But if you just mean, will they override each other? Let's see what happens. The lower actions widget gets it. So in this way, is this overridable? Yes, in that the higher actions widget is overridden by any actions widget lower in the tree that maps that intent. So let's look at one more quick example to illustrate this. So now basically the same exact setup, except that the lower actions widget does not map our intent. So we're invoking my intent, and this is an empty map. It's not mapping it. So the question is, will the top actions receive the intent or not? Will it be blocked by the lower actions? So I'll give you a second to think while I bring up that again. Okay. All right, so who says that the actions will receive the intent? By raise of hands. All right, and who says that it will not receive it? All right, let's try it out. So the higher actions in the tree did receive it. So when an actions does not map an intent, the traversal just continues straight through. So we iterate up the tree, it sees the first actions, it says my intent is not in this map, so I'm going to continue up the tree, and the higher actions gets it. All right, so now we got a handle on how shortcuts work, so let's look at, or rather actions, so let's look at shortcuts now and combining the two. All right, so back to my demo here, shortcuts. All right, so now I've got just an empty app, and we're going to try to listen to some actual keyboard events this time. So that's what shortcuts does. So let's look at the code here. We've just got an empty app with press backspace in the middle of the screen. So let's go ahead and add a shortcuts widget and an actions widget to our app. All right, so still just the text with press backspace. Now we've got a shortcuts widget, and it's listening to the backspace key. And it's calling backspace intent, which once again is something that I've defined myself down below. So just something custom I made. And up above, an actions widget that maps backspace intent to some callback that's going to show another snack bar. So let's try that one. So come here, and I'm going to press the backspace key. And once again, nothing happens. There's a bug in here again. And I wonder if anybody can see what this one is. It's something that I've sort of mentioned throughout this talk, but anybody notice why we're not receiving that backspace key? Yeah, somebody said it, focus. We're missing focus. Nothing here is focus. And the traversal that does this to find the shortcuts and the actions is all based on focus. So these are not going to receive that backspace key. So let's go ahead and add some focus to this app. So now, rather than just the text, we've got a button. And if I look at the code, when I tap this button, it's going to just set focus on itself. So since it's lower in the tree than the shortcuts and actions widget, the traversal will start here at the focus node, which is inside text button, and go up the tree, and it will pass by both shortcuts and actions, and they should receive it. So let's try that. So actually, if I don't tap on the button first, I press backspace, nothing happens because the focus hasn't yet been set. But if I press the button, it should set focus, and then there we go. We've received the intent. All right, so let's go back to our presentation. And another couple of quick quiz questions to see how we were doing on this. So here we've got our actions widget at the top, just like we did in that demo, and we've got two nested shortcuts widgets. The first one is mapping to do nothing intent, and do nothing intent is built in, and it just does nothing. But it's something built into Flutter, and the shortcuts above it maps to my backspace intent. So the question is, does this actions receive the intent, my backspace intent, yes or no? So let me, again, give you a few seconds while I bring that up. All right, so who says that the actions will receive the intent? Yes. All right, a few people. And who says no? All right, most people are saying no. Let's try that out. So I'm going to tap this to set the focus and then press backspace. And indeed, nothing happens. It did not receive the intent. And that's because do nothing intent, it does map to something. So the traversal stops whenever it maps to anything. Even if it's doing nothing, the traversal stops there. So the second shortcuts, the higher shortcuts widget does not get called. And so actions is never triggered. All right, so one more question. So now we've got shortcuts kind of surrounded by two actions widgets. And the question is going to be, which of these two actions widgets will receive the intent? So let me get that one set up. All right, so who thinks that the higher actions widget will receive it? All right, and who thinks the lower actions widget will receive it? All right, we're pretty split on this one. Let's try it. So tap and then backspace. The lower actions widget received it. And so here's why. I mentioned that when keys are pressed, when intents are invoked, we're traversing up the tree, and we're doing that starting at the focus both times. So first, when the key is pressed, we'll traverse from around here, and we'll hit the shortcuts and map to backspace intent. And then we need to find the action. So we do another traversal, and we start again down here at the focus. So you might have thought we're starting at shortcuts still, but no, the traversal starts over from the focus and goes up. So the first actions widget gets it. All right, so now we've seen actions, we've seen shortcuts. We kind of have a basic understanding of how to trigger some keyboard shortcuts using this. So let's apply this to the actual drawing app. So going back to Flutter Paint here. So I have like a few different versions of this app. So we're going to start with no keyboard functionality. When I was playing around with it at the beginning, that was the full-on app. So now if I like click around here, I press backspace or Command C, Command V, like nothing's happening. Nothing is hooked up. So let's look at that code really quickly just to get a handle on what this looks like with no keyboard shortcuts. So here's the code for the canvas, which is just the empty area where my rectangles and all that are going. And how it works is it's just a stack, and each rectangle or text field or whatever is just positioned within that stack. So what I want to do is receive some intents here with an actions widget so that the canvas can like remove marks, copy marks, paste marks, that kind of thing. And then actually inside of the marks, I want to receive the shortcuts. So let's look at that code. And here's my marks. So yeah, this actually just draws the rectangular text field. And I want to add a shortcuts widget here to listen to keyboard events on those. So let's go ahead and move to the next one where I've done that. And we'll look at canvas.dart. So back down here, here we go. We have a big actions widget with mappings for cut, copy, paste, delete, select all marks. So these are all intents that I made up for this, nothing built in. And then I just added these callbacks to actually go and do that, that action on each one. So for the marks now, we have a bunch of shortcuts here. So here's my shortcuts widget. There it is in its mapping. It's using the adaptive shortcuts map, which I've defined up here. So I have this like a little bit fancy just because we have multiple platforms. Like on Mac and iOS, you use the meta key or like the command key, but on others, it's Control C, Control V. So just like splitting this up with a switch statement to be a little bit nice there. But yeah, so these will receive all of these different keyboard shortcuts to dispatch the actions, then the canvas will receive them. So let's check that out. All right, so I'm on my basic keyboard functionality, and here we go. So if I Command C, Command V, you can see I can get back to pasting these. It works like normal. I can delete them, etc. Great. All right. But when I originally demoed this, we talked about doing text fields and having that kind of overlap with the functionality of the text field. So given that I haven't written any code that specifically handles this case of overlapping keyboard shortcuts yet, all I've done is just say when you just said all marks receive these keyboard shortcuts and send them to the canvas. So my question is, if I create a text field mark and I press delete, add some text and then focus it, press delete, what will happen? Will it delete a letter? Or will it delete the whole mark right away? Let me go ahead and get ready to try that out. Whoops. Oh, well, there's your answer. Deletes the whole mark. I didn't get to quiz you guys that time. But yeah, so to do that in more slow-mo, if I type that right. So yeah, if I press delete, it's not going to delete a character. It's going to go straight to removing the mark. And let's explore a little bit about why that happened and what's going on. And to understand that, let's start with how does Flutter handle these built-in shortcuts? Because actually, maybe surprisingly, the backspace key is a keyboard shortcut in Flutter. So the backspace key is not handled like in the engine or the platform or anything. It's handled in the framework as a keyboard shortcut, just like we've been doing. So let's see how that works. We're going to look at the kind of a widget hierarchy here. So at the top, we have a widgets app, which is something that's built by like Material app or Cupertino app. So it's at the top of pretty much like every Flutter app out there. And inside of that, it creates a default text editing shortcuts widget. And what that is it creates a shortcuts widget you see here. And the mapping that it passes it is basically every keyboard shortcut that Flutter supports. So for every platform like web, everything, Windows, all of the keyboard shortcuts, a bunch of common shortcuts. So it's just this huge, huge mapping for a shortcuts widget at the very top of the widget tree. I thought I lost my presentation. There it is. So below that, we have like the user's app. So you have like your material app and then like a home parameter or whatever, and you're building your app in there. And then in the user's app, they might use an editable text, which for the record, the editable text is built by textfield and Cupertino textfield. So it's kind of like the backing widget for those. So in the user's app, they have a text field somewhere. And inside of that editable text, there's an actions widget. So here's completing the circle that we talked about here. We got a shortcuts up at top. We've got an actions down low in the widget tree. So let's look at the code here for editable text and see this actions widget. There it is. So here we're in like the build method for editable text state. It's passing some actions here. And if I scroll up and look at what that is, it's just mapping all of the intents that we saw in default text editing shortcuts to some code that actually modifies the text in the text field, like deletes a character, moves the cursor, all of those different things. So these are just all the same intents that you saw in default text editing shortcuts. I lost my presentation again. All right, so let's walk through this and see what happens when a user is actually using a keyboard shortcut and how each one of these things responds. So again, we're starting with focus. So the user focuses the editable text. Then they press a key and we start a traversal up the widget tree with backspace, looking for some shortcuts that handle this. And we go up out of the editable text through the user's app and we reach default text editing shortcuts and find that it maps backspace to delete character intent. So then we start our second traversal, just like normal, back down here at the focus with delete character intent. And now we're looking for an actions that maps delete character intent to some callback. And immediately we find it here in the actions within editable text because we started where it's focused, which is the editable text, and there's an actions widget in there already. So immediately we find it here. And there's delete text action, which we would have just seen in the actions, or rather the editable text source code, and that will like delete a single character or whatever keyboard shortcut it is. And there you go. That's what would happen in a normal text field, but that's not what we saw when we just tried the drawing app, right? When we pressed backspace, it deleted the mark. It didn't do this. So why did that happen and why didn't this happen? So let's start over considering that this is our drawing app. So once again, we're focusing the editable text. Just like you saw, I clicked that like text mark. I typed hello world or whatever and focused it. So then I press backspace. This starts traversing up the tree. And in this case, we have in the user's app, I had a shortcuts widget, right? We added that to our drawing app, and that mapped backspace to delete selected mark intent. So that's like an intent that we defined inside of our app for ourselves. So rather than like delete character text intent or whatever it was, we have our own special one that deletes marks. And so we found that because the traversal goes from the leaf all the way up to the root of the tree for default text editing shortcuts. So that gives us the opportunities to override things in the user's app, just like we did in our drawing app. So then once again, we come back down. We're now looking for an actions that maps delete selected mark intent. And since this is our own like special intent we defined, editable text actions doesn't know anything about it. It does not map this intent. So it can go straight through the editable text and out back into the user's app. And as we saw in the drawing app, we had an actions widget there too that mapped delete selected mark intent to actually deleting the mark. And so that's what happens in our drawing app. And that's why when we press backspace, it did not delete a character. It immediately removed the mark. All right, so now we've kind of seen like incidentally how to override some text field behavior. So let's try to actually purposefully do this and change some behavior of text field. So back in our demo app, text field demo. So let's try to change Control or Command A. Instead of selecting all, let's try to make it like delete a character like backspace. And let's make like Control B will select all. So we're just swapping things around a little bit. So if I look at the source code here, we've just got a plain old text field with some padding, that's it. And what we want to do is add a shortcuts widget into our like users app layer that will receive those built-in events and change what happens with this behavior. So let's go on to the second step and look at that source code. So here I've got all I added was a shortcuts widget. And here you can see I'm changing Control A and Meta A, Control B and Meta B to different intents. So these intents are built in: delete character intent, select all text intent. These are what Flutter uses internally. And they're also exposed if you're importing the widgets library. So we have access to these. We can catch these, and we can remap the keys to do these kind of intents and send them to the built-in editable text actions. So if I try this, no tricks this time. I'm pressing Command A, and it's acting like the backspace key. And if I press Command B, it acts like Command A. So I've successfully swapped things around just by using a single shortcuts widget. All right. So now a quick quiz about this. So here in our users app, we're using a material app. So we're going to have default text editing shortcuts up in the top of our tree. We've got an actions widget in our app, and we're mapping select all text intent to our own custom callback. So this is another built-in intent that we saw. This is not a custom one. It's built into Flutter, and we've got a text field here. So different than what we just saw, this is not a shortcuts widget that's overriding something. This is just an actions widget. So the question here is, will text be selected, or will actions receive this and block that? And I'm going to pull out that demo really quick. Okay, so by raise of hands, who thinks that the text will be selected? All right, and who thinks that the actions will get it and stop it? Okay, another good 50-50 split. Let's see what happens here. The actions gets it. So let's look more closely about what happens there. Actually, based on what we had just learned, we would think that the actions widget inside of editable text should have caught that, right? Because the traversal starts down in the editable text, so it should have been caught and never made it to our user app where we had our actions widget. But why isn't that what happened? Well, that's because somebody mentioned overridable, and I said actions.overridable. That's a special case of actions, so that was a little bit of a trick question. But we use something called actions.overridable within editable text. You may have seen that when I opened up the source code, but every intent to action mapping inside of editable text uses actions.overridable. So what is that? It basically says, we want this action to be overridable by something above it. So if you find this mapping and it's actions.overridable, keep doing the traversal and see if you find anything else you can use. And this is important because, you saw, the actions widget is in a leaf at the very bottom. So there's not a lot of opportunity for the user to override that. Otherwise, it would be basically trapped inside of there if you're trying to override something that's focused at a leaf and then wrapped immediately in an actions widget. So that's what this enables. So what happens is that here it is caught by this actions widget in editable text when we do our Command A and our select all. But then because it's overridable, it keeps looking up the tree. And it says, oh, wait, there is another actions widget that maps this. And here it is in the user's app. And so I'm going to call that one instead. All right. So question about actions.overridable. So here we've got two nested actions widgets, both using actions.overridable. And my question is, what's going to happen when we do that? So let me set that up while you guys think about it again. And I guess this is our last quiz question, so you guys can relax after this one. All right, so who thinks that the upper actions will receive this? All right, and the lower actions? Okay, pretty close again. It looked like majority said the upper actions, but let's try it. And the higher actions gets it. So even though the higher one is overridable, it will be used like normal. So what will happen, I think I have no, I don't. So what will happen is we traverse up the tree, we reach the lower actions, it says overridable, so we keep traversing up the tree. We find the second actions, it's also overridable, so we keep going up the tree all the way to the root of the tree, and we say there's nothing else. So what was the last actions that I found? That's the upper actions, and that's why that one is called. All right. But going back to the text field question, I did the demo and we saw that it was. Here we go. So we saw that it was captured and my actions were triggered here. But actually, if anybody were to try this, like following along on the web or anything like that, you might have noticed that that's not what happens on the web. So I just did Command A. It did not catch it in the actions. It actually selected all. And so the behavior is different between Flutter Web and other platforms, which is a bit scary. So why is that happening? So to really explain this, let's quickly go through like how this kind of text editing stuff works on all of these platforms. So as a basic refresher, like all of this text editing stuff in Flutter is handled by Flutter itself. So like just like everything in Flutter, Flutter's drawing everything, doing everything itself. So for these two text fields, like an Android looking one and a Cupertino one, everything here is drawn by Flutter. The text, the selection highlight, the handles, the context menu here, all of it is controlled, drawn by Flutter. But on web, it's unique in that while all of that is still true and Flutter is still drawing and handling everything, it's backed by a browser input tag on the web. And all of those shortcuts are going to be handled by that input tag rather than by Flutter. And that's key to why we have different behavior there. So in Flutter Web, you may have noticed this when I looked at the source code before, but here, so we're back in default text editing shortcuts at the top of the tree, our big, huge shortcuts mapping. Here for web, all of these shortcuts are mapped to do nothing and stop propagation text intent, every one of these. And so what that does, I think I have it in here, it allows the intent, or rather the keyboard shortcut, to be handled by the platform. So do nothing and stop propagation intent says, okay, stop the traversal, just stop right here and give this keyboard shortcut to the platform. And so that's how web is able to handle those kind of things. So the input tag then receives the shortcut and it will handle it in its own way. So if we look back at our like widget hierarchy diagram, we need to add kind of another sort of layer here, which is the platform at the top of everything. And so on web, what happens when I go through this process again of doing a keyboard shortcut, we focus it, we press the backspace key, but in default text editing shortcuts, we get do nothing and stop propagation intent. And that immediately says, okay, stop all this, just give it to the platform, which in this case is the browser. And that input tag receives the delete key and does its thing. Or in the case of our demo, it was Command A to select all. So this is an important caveat to be aware of. When you're using actions, when you're overriding actions, it's important to remember that Flutter Web does not use those actions. However, shortcuts, it does use. Actually, you might have noticed all those other demos we did with shortcuts, they work exactly the same on web and on all other platforms. And that's because you can still map these keyboard shortcuts to your normal intents and things, and it will still behave the same if you don't send it to the platform. But when you're dealing with actions, it's already been mapped. If you haven't stopped it with a shortcuts widget, those intents have already been mapped to do nothing and stop propagation intent. So be careful and keep that in mind. All right, so let's now tie that all together, come back to our Flutter Paint demo, and let's actually do this feature where we can press delete to delete characters, or when it's empty, press delete to delete the mark. Let's see how to implement that. All right, so back to our demo. Flutter Paint, and let's look at the final code once again. So here in my canvas code, I've kept it actually completely the same. So we have still just our actions here that receive all of these intents, including like the delete intent, which always is going to delete a mark. So this code is all the same. What we're going to do is prevent this intent from reaching this place in the case that we don't want to delete a character, or rather in the case that we don't want to delete a mark and we do want to delete a character. So the mark code, so this is my code here for the text mark specifically. And here I've got a shortcuts widget where I'm listening specifically for text field mark related stuff. And basically I'm just doing a simple conditional. So if the text is empty, then I'm going to map the backspace key to one mark, delete selected mark intent. And if it's not empty, then I'll map it to the default one that Flutter uses. And so actually, as a quick caveat, like you wouldn't actually even need the second if on non-web platforms, but you do need it on web. Otherwise, it would be handled by the platform. So let's try this out. All right, so here we go. I can press delete and delete characters, and once I reach the end, deletes the mark. I've successfully decided when I want to use Flutter's default built-in functionality and when I want to do my own custom stuff. All right, so I hope I've given everyone kind of a good intro to this and some confidence in how to use this intense action shortcuts system and the confidence to build your own keyboard shortcuts and override some of Flutter's own. Remember that this kind of setup, it's great for that kind of decoupled, more loose architecture, declarative architecture. But we do have much simpler, more straightforward ways to get keyboard shortcuts if you're not looking for something that abstract like that. So check out callback shortcuts, focus.on key event, and just keyboard listener if you're looking for something like that. Otherwise, when you really want the like overrideability and all of that, check out shortcuts, intents, and actions. And the last caveat, definitely don't forget that the built-in actions aren't used on web, or you'll have different behavior on Flutter Web and on other platforms. And again, thank you guys so much for coming to my talk.